If you can believe it, Congress is moving faster than the SEC, and the market didn't see it coming.
We're looking at a real ground shift for foreign private issuers. Longstanding exemptions are disappearing, and the era of regulatory accommodation may be over.
From Section 16 reporting to the possibility of quarterly filings, the rules are changing in real time.
And we'll break down the infrastructure companies need now to make sure directors and officers aren't caught in the next compliance storm.
Welcome to the pre-read.
Just like the slides you get before a big meeting, the pre-read prepares you, CFOs and other executives, for the next big thing. It's the global podcast where finance, sustainability, audit, and risk teams come together in the C-suite.
If you're making decisions at scale or need to understand the leaders who are, you're in the right place. This is the pre-read brought to you by Workiva. I'm Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado.
And I'm Melissa Zucker, sustainability nerd and equal opportunist caffeine addict. For decades, foreign private issuers in the U.S. capital markets operated under a different set of expectations. More flexibility, fewer reporting requirements, and a sense that accommodations were built into the system. But now, that assumption is breaking down.
As part of the annual defense budget, Congress passed and the President signed the Holding Foreign Insiders Accountable Act. And the move caught many by surprise, eliminating long-standing Section 16 exemptions for foreign officers and directors, which, for example, include requirements for them to disclose when they buy or sell stock. It's been an important part of compensation disclosures for domestic companies in the U.S., and now foreign companies trading in the U.S. will need to make those disclosures too.
Today, we're joined by Chelsea Hall, Workiva Industry Principal and former Global Controller, and Alan Wilson, partner at WilmerHale. Together, we'll unpack what this moment really means. So, Steve, what stood out to you?
Well, as you said in the intro, Alyssa, it's the end of deference. This legislation signals a clear shift that the U.S. is no longer deferring to foreign regulatory regimes. Access to U.S. capital markets increasingly means meeting U.S. standards, full stop. And second, operational readiness now is mandatory for these companies. With deadlines rapidly approaching, these companies need to act now. And that means educating directors and officers, securing EDGAR credentials so they can actually make the filings, and building internal reporting processes that can meet the strict 2-day filing windows. Alyssa, what stood out to you?
Well, the first is really that Congress is steering the agenda here. This act reflects a broader trend of Congress stepping in, and on a bipartisan basis, I'll add, to accelerate regulatory change, often bypassing the slower, traditional SEC rulemaking process. The second, and this is a theme that I think we're hearing more often, is resilience over reaction. Regulatory change isn't episodic anymore. It's constant. Leaders who invest in agile compliance infrastructure and strong change management controls will be far better positioned than those that are relying on reactive fixes. But I do actually want to say there's one thing that we missed, or I wish we had maybe dived into a little bit more in this conversation, and that's back to that idea or trend of Congress steering the agenda. And what does that mean in terms of broader downstream impacts or kind of a judgmental net good or net bad? Is this, an example of agencies losing power or purview over the very specialty thing they're meant to govern? Or is this an example of us getting rid of some red tape and really accelerating key needs in the regulatory process?
Well, I'm certainly not a constitutional attorney, obviously, but I think the way that I would characterize it is it actually is taking away some of that regulatory power, but it's actually putting it back to Congress where it has always resided. And I think what we see is that when there is unanimity and bipartisan support for certain issues, Congress is willing to move, and they're willing to move quickly. And that's exactly what played out here. So with that, let's get to our conversation with Alan and Chelsea.
Alan, thanks for being here. Can you summarize the change for us that's impacting for private issuers? How big of an impact do you think this will have? And is there anything that surprised you about the new rule?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for background, in December of 25, President Trump signed into law the annual defense budget legislation, as happens every year. And this year, it included an act called the Holding Foreign Insiders Accountable Act. What this does is it removes a longstanding exemption from the reporting requirements of Section 16A of the Exchange Act, for directors and officers of foreign private issuers, or FPIs. As noted, FPI directors and officers have never had to comply with the Section 16 reporting requirements that domestic companies have. So that in and of itself is a significant change. So what happens is the act is tailored just to directors and officers. Under the normal Section 16 requirements, greater than 10% equity holders typically have Section 16 reporting requirements, but under the act, they remain exempt from those requirements. So there is a bit of a distinction between a domestic company and an FPI. In addition, Section 16 has a few components. There's the Form 4, Form 3, and Form 5 reporting requirements, which the Form 4 are the ones that are more problematic and due within 2 business days of transactions. Those are the ones that apply to directors and officers of FPIs under the Act. Notably, though, the short swing liability provisions and short sale restrictions under Section 16, which apply and can result in disgorgement of short swing profit for non-exempt opposite way trades, does not apply to directors and officers of FPIs. So this is a reporting requirement only. It doesn't have the profit disgorgement element. Nevertheless, it is a disclosure change. Those who are familiar with U.S. domestic companies know this is typically something handled by the company themselves. The filings are, of course, the requirement or the obligation of the insider themselves, but necessarily the insider's company will be involved in the process for reporting. So it will be a change, particularly for those outside the U.S. who have not historically had to have a reporting requirement as it relates to their share activity in the company. In terms of the surprise element you asked about, not many people were expecting it in December, but it's not entirely a surprise. It really is the result of a bipartisan effort that dates back to 2022 and was designed to apply the same set of Section 16 rules to insiders of all companies. But notably, the SEC has been tasked with implementing the rule. So what we have is an act of Congress, not the SEC yet. The Congressional Act instructs the SEC to effectuate this required change.
I know earlier in 2025, I believe June, the SEC published concept release requesting feedback on the definition of foreign private issuers. And I know this is asking you to guess, but do you think that this is going to be the last we see of changes to foreign private issuers, or do you expect there's going to be more changes either in the form of, one, they could change the requirements of foreign private issuers like they did with this legislation, or two, change the definition of who qualifies as a foreign private issuer?
I think what we'll see from the new SEC is further change for foreign private issuers. There has been a significant shift in the composition of SEC foreign private issuer entities, including a number of entities that are now based in other jurisdictions that don't have the same level of rigor around their disclosure. So the approach to giving more deference to those international jurisdictions may no longer be supported for policy or other reasons that were in play in 2003, because the jurisdictional environment is just different for the composition of companies that fit within the definition. So I think there is still going to be further changes as it relates to FPIs, whether it's through the definition of an FPI or frankly the accommodations afforded to FPIs more generally through the 20F disclosures and the like. And certainly the SEC or the congressional action recently to change the Section 16 reporting is a step toward that in terms of taking away one accommodation. And you can imagine there might be others that follow as the SEC puts that into context of its greater FPI initiative, coupled, of course, with the important elements of IFRS and what the SEC decides to do as it relates to potential convergence, which I'm using loosely in terms of how we think about, GAAP versus IFRS, and maybe not necessarily the convergence we saw in the early 2000s, but certainly one in terms of bringing standards closer together to minimize those gaps. So I think a lot on the horizon, and this is certainly not the last we'll see for FPIs.
To me, I think to many of us, the surprise and even irony, if I could use that word, is that Congress actually moved significantly faster on this than the SEC possibly could have, because they would have done some kind of a concept release, asked for public comment, there would be some analysis of the comments, all the process that we've seen play out at the commission. I'm just wondering what actually happened to kind of make this possible, to get that bipartisan unity to be able to move so quickly. And I think importantly, does this signal that maybe future rule changes for SEC rules could actually happen through Congress versus the commission? Any thoughts on kind of how this played out behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to say entirely how this played out. I do think what we've seen recently, certainly in the last couple of years, and really with this current administration, is more focus on the activities of the SEC and really what it means for public companies. We saw a lot of scrutiny in the last election cycle around DEI, climate, and other initiatives under the former SEC administration. And so I think what you're observing is Congress taking greater note of the SEC and its rulemaking activity and are acting more directly in response. And so that's a power that Congress has always had, of course. And in fact, many of the more notable securities acts, of course, have been passed by Congress as required by the way our form of government works. But you're right that we could very well see more direct legislation for specific SEC activities than we have in years past. Certainly interesting to note that in the foreign space, we've had bipartisan support for a number of years. We've got continued focus on all things foreign and domestic in terms of what the role of the U.S. should be and how we think about a more protectionist versus non-protectionist globalized economy. And that's going to continue to play out. Too early to tell where it will land. But I do think that you'll continue to see that shift. Congress has always been interested in what the SEC is doing, but I think now they're very much taking affirmative action in a number of ways to say, let's have our voices be heard as it relates to what the SEC's core mission is intended to be. And let's take what action we can at Congress to support that, because there is a lot you hear from Congress and you hear from the current leadership at the SEC of getting back to basics. The SEC's core function, and Chair Atkins has been pretty notable in his remarks in that respect, in terms of reining back in the SEC to what he and others view as its primary objectives. And I suspect Congress is watching with great interest to see where the SEC progresses, and will be an area where we continue to see further engagement. It may be not the same significant congressional act like a Dodd-Frank bill that's hundreds and hundreds of pages long with a ton of rules. It's probably more specific. But I can imagine that this will not be the last thing we see from Congress as it relates to rulemaking in the near term.
So I want to actually go back and anchor on a message that I've heard pretty consistent. And, as the resident non-financial reporting host of this podcast, I wrote it down what you said, Alan, that essentially this is us no longer giving deference to foreign jurisdictions or the companies that operate within them, right? And that seems like very aligned with general trends that you see happening across the American government and policies. So I don't know, just want to call that out, that seems very clear in terms of like a consistent strategy, and in terms of like what else might we expect for foreign private issuers. Very much imagine that this ain't the end of the road. The story isn't over on this. Probably we'll see some other things. What should public companies, whether you're a foreign private issuer or even just a general public company, what should you be thinking about or expecting in terms of other changes that might come? And not just the change, but how rapidly and almost unexpectedly it might come. How do you prepare for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So certainly I think the rapidness of change is something to be expected, because everything we hear from the current administration, even outside the SEC, pick your government agency, is to move quickly and to enact the current administration's priorities. So that's fair. And I think just continuing to monitor all things happening in Washington through executive orders, congressional action, agency action, and rulemaking is really something to be focused on. I would also say that as you think about what to anticipate, a lot of this initiative is using the U.S. as the benchmark, at the level setter, the trend setter in these areas of disclosure. It's interesting that the Act here in the Section 16 space provides that the SEC could exempt any person, security, or transaction subject to substantially similar requirements in a foreign jurisdiction, which is to say, we'll give deference and you can comply with your foreign jurisdiction requirements effectively, provided they're equivalent or substantially similar to what we have in the U.S. So we're really raising the bar and not lowering it in terms of this action. And I suspect that you'll see that going forward with respect to any other changes that might be viewed as a historic accommodation, where we're either pulling back or imposing more of a U.S. style view. In particular, on the current action, certainly I think there are a lot of things that companies need to do. For foreign private issuers specifically, there's education to be had, which is for directors and officers, educating them on the new requirements and keeping them up to speed quickly is really important. Probably setting some sort of routine cadence for briefing on U.S. regulatory developments is probably useful as well. Those are likely in place for a lot of the more established companies anyway, but for these quicker changes, I think that having a more robust and repeatable training process is probably a good idea. It's also important to take a fresh look at policies and procedures that might have reflected these accommodations and ensuring that they're getting updated in real time. There are control-related elements there. So for the accountants in the room that have SOX and other internal control requirements, that's something to be mindful of. And then certainly if you're on the company side and you're tasked with facilitating these reporting obligations, it's important to understand that there's a lot of blocking and tackling behind the scenes for this to happen. There's the obtaining of EDGAR codes for individuals who maybe never had EDGAR codes. That can be a time-consuming process. The reporting timing is fairly quick. For transactions reportable in Form 4, those are due within 2 business days of the transaction itself. This is a pretty quick turnaround time, meaning that you need good internal reporting mechanisms to identify the transaction in the first instance and have the machinery and the access codes in place so that they can be reported and filed by the applicable deadlines. And so there's probably going to be some growing pain for companies who haven't exercised these muscles before in terms of getting the internal infrastructure in place and getting up to speed on the requirements, which are, I must say, quite technical for Section 16. Their entire bodies of law are around the reporting requirements based upon the equity, vehicles at play, and certainly for foreign issuers that have a little bit different equity structures than you typically see in U.S. public companies, I could imagine more interpretive questions in terms of how things need to be reported on the forms themselves, just taking into account the different nuances in their vehicles at play. So there's a lot of work to be done in the interim until these requirements go effective, just to make sure that the companies are ready. And I think that the March deadline will be here before we know it.
You know, this conversation is actually really reminding me of one that we had just recently on this podcast with our own CEO, Julie Iskow. And, you know, one of the things she said in that was, we are living in a place where change is constant. And what companies need to really do is be investing in stability and agility. Like, that's how you build resilience in this storm. And this feels like a very real world example of that. And hearing you talk about investing in the infrastructure, like investing in the processes and the infrastructure and the ability for your company to have that resilience and be able to have the agility to meet these new requirements that might come up.
Absolutely. And I would say it sort of underscores a point I've been making for the past few years, which is really investing in change management controls and having oversight over change management has become ever more critical in this current environment where change happens at a faster and faster pace and seems to be on relatively extreme bases, you know, from one extreme to another. So I think to all of the things your CEO indicated on the last podcast hold entirely true here. And I think that's a thematic element we should all keep in mind as we think about how to approach the years ahead.
Chelsea, how big a deal is this going to be? I mean, you've lived in the FPI world for quite a while. I mean, of all the things that Alan laid out, I mean, is this going to be a big lift?
I mean, I think it depends. What's interesting is that they have like your home jurisdiction's already doing it. It probably isn't, but then you might be exempt from it. But if you're not already tracking that internally because there isn't a home jurisdiction requirement, then yeah, it's going to be a big lift. And especially even for organizations that have good controls in place, like so many directors and officers trade securities and don't tell anybody. And then you're filing a Form 5 and it's a big exercise at the end of the year. But out of all the things they could do, I mean, this is probably small in comparison to them saying you can't use IFRS. Like if I'm a foreign private issuer, that's the thing I'm the most panicked about right now is them coming back and saying like, you have to use US GAAP. That's a huge exercise and undertaking. So in comparison, I think it's small, and directors and officers are always difficult to monitor and get them to follow the controls.
Yeah. You know, the other interesting thing here is that I think when we first started talking about foreign private issuers and the frequency of reporting, you know, semi-annual versus quarterly, foreign private issuers only have to do it semi-annually. I think the question was, would the domestic U.S. market sort of level down to FPIs, or would FPIs have to sort of like level up to the domestic? And we still see that play out. I think we probably have an answer to the question, which is perhaps everybody's going to level down. I'm curious, so Alan, do you think it could actually go the other direction where perhaps foreign private issuers have to be reporting quarterly and then domestic companies only semi-annual reporting is kind of like sticking it to the foreign companies?
Yeah, no. I don't think it would be that way. I think we would certainly align. I mean, all of what we're hearing from the SEC is to bring greater alignment because it's too complicated for auditors and accountants to sort of navigate both when they're so wildly different, particularly if there are opportunities to bring them closer together. And it's the same here, which is if we're amending the FPI definition or the requirements for FPIs concurrently with what we're doing for reporting, just as an example, I think the idea would be that it needs to be the same across the board. What I really think the interesting social experiment will be is if we allow U.S. companies to go to semi-annual reporting, to how many actually do it. Because I still think the demand from the investor community is such that there will still be some degree of quarterly reporting, maybe not a formalized 10Q, but it'll be a pretty robust press release, I'm going to assume, just for purposes of keeping the markets up to date. And, it's obviously beyond the scope of this discussion, but really it's interesting to see what other follow-on effects will come from that, including comfort letters, what the investment community will need in that respect, whether the PCOB rules change for the staleness rules, because currently that would require quarterly reporting to stay within the staleness regime. It's a whole host of factors that need to be thought through. And I just don't know that you'll see the market shift.
Well, you certainly have some former financial reporting professionals on this podcast that I think would agree with you wholeheartedly. Well, Alan Wilson, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. And as always, we really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see and chat with you all.
Thank you again to our guests, Chelsea Hall and Alan Wilson, and thank you for listening.
This has been the Pre-Read, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, sustainability, audit, and risk.
We've got more insights and hot takes coming your way, so be sure to follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your edge.
If you liked the show, leave a review, send it to someone you love, or just shout it out on your next team call.
We'll see you next time, and until then, go lead it like you mean it.
I'm Alyssa Zucker, and that's Steve Soder. Our lead producer is Mike Ravagno, with audio engineering by Drew Hayes.
Pedro Sousa is our graphic designer. Transcripts are created and edited by Courtney Kinsey. And thanks to our digital and social team, Mike Berg, Katie Carr, and Michael Karnowski.